Hello, guys. Welcome to another episode of Against the Turn. Today, I'm joined in with my fellow admins of ICF, Ame and Aquin. How they go, guys?
Hey, dude. I'm all good, man.
And we have with us a renowned cricket journalist, correspondent on ESPN Cricket Info, and an expert in associate cricket, and in particular USA cricket, Peter Della Penna in the house. Hey, Peter. How's it going?
Pleasure, guys. Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to this a lot.
Yeah, so we got a lot to cover, and we'll be in particular covering a lot of associate cricket today because we have the expert in the house in Peter. So let's get right into this. I would like to start, Peter, with something really positive news, which is coming from the world of ICC, and that is that an interesting deal has been made between ICC and IMG, from what I'm hearing, and that they're planning to cover over 500 plus cricket games of the associate nations leading up to the 2023 World Cup. What do you make of this, and how exciting is this for all the associate nations whose fans have been eagerly waiting to actually watch their team play? And how is it going to impact the cricket? And in particular, is this subscription based? Just tell us something about this.
Well, the first thing is that it is just a hugely significant broadcast deal from the standpoint of just purely broadcasting games. In the full member world, test world, you take it for granted that every test match is going to be broadcast. And some way or another, the boards, home board, visiting board, depending on how deep the negotiations go, sometimes it doesn't get settled until a couple of days before the match, but they get broadcast is the bottom line, because the interest is there, but also the nature of how things have evolved now with whether it's World Test Championship or ODI Super League matches in now being broadcast with context for World Cup qualification points at stake. There needs to be some sort of uniformity, and that results in all of these matches being broadcast. And now that has extended to the associate level. So in the past, you would have a lot of these matches played in the dark meaning just no broadcast, off TV. And now that you're going to have exposure for a lot of teams, many of them for the first time, I think one of the things that was put out in the press release is that more than 50 teams are going to have matches broadcast for the first time. This is something that traditionally is a major obstacle in terms of some very basic or baseline challenges that these countries face. One, just getting the word out there, just getting the exposure, letting people know that you exist. Hey, we have a national team. We actually play. We're playing in matches that are contextual in terms of World Cup qualifying. These things have always been a challenge because, in a lot of ways, associate countries are for the longest time have had to be self-sufficient. So if you take a country like Nepal, for example, they've got the interest level there in terms of a fan base, in terms of a playing culture. Being a border country with India, you've got some kind of seepage or osmosis, however you want to characterize it, where the cricket is broadcast there, international matches broadcast there, and it's seeped into the culture. And their success, their organic success at under-19 World Cups, and then coming up through to gain ODI status, has warranted the demand for matches to be broadcast by local broadcasters. So, for example, when I was, what feels like forever ago now, it's a little bit over a year ago now, when before this broadcast deal was struck, it was basically up to the home countries who were hosting matches to figure out a way to source a broadcast if they felt it was a financially feasible initiative. So, but in Nepal, you never had that issue. So when I was in Nepal, they had broadcast, and it was broadcast on TV. They had a local television network, bid for the rights, and there was competition. That's also a thing. You had different networks competing for rights. They got the rights, and so all the matches in the ODI Tri-Series that USA, Nepal, and Oman played broadcast on local television, and then subsequently you had web stream that was put out to the world, and USA, their broadcast partner Willow TV, subcontracted the rights, so the matches were shown on Willow TV and through Willow TV web stream for the US audience. But outside of Nepal, that's very rare. You might have a country like Scotland, who in recent years kind of made bigger efforts to get their matches broadcast, not necessarily on TV. They were focusing their efforts more on web streaming and getting a stream out. So, for example, when they hosted Sri Lanka before the 2019 World Cup, they had matches broadcast, but they were web streamed. It wasn't a full-fledged TV broadcast. But then you go to other countries, the further down the pecking order you go, and if it's Papua New Guinea, there's no guarantee that matches with Papua New Guinea at home are going to be broadcast. Or beyond that, Canada, there's no guarantee that Canada's matches are going to be broadcast. So the major significance of this deal is that that self-sufficiency that was the onus previously had been on individual countries themselves to find the resources and find the means to broadcast these games. That has now been shifted. The onus has been shifted to the ICC, and they've taken it upon themselves to say, hey, we want to help you guys get the exposure, and we're not going to place that financial burden on you to come up with the resources out of your own budgets to pay for broadcasting equipment, broadcasting services, dip into your own pockets. And now the fact that the ICC has deemed these matches worthy of broadcast has a knock-on effect that just simply by virtue of being broadcast, all of a sudden it's like a psychological factor. It's like, oh, matches being broadcast, it must be important. If it's important enough to be broadcast, well, I guess it's worth watching. So I'm going to pay attention to this now. And that kind of snowball effect will hopefully lead to the countries themselves having greater interest in terms of viewership, and hopefully that leads to greater engagement in terms of participation, grassroots engagement, especially at the youth level, getting more kids, getting more boys and girls involved in playing in these countries. And it's going to take you a few years to see the impact. But if you just look at the data that the ICC referenced as justification for this broadcast deal, every tournament that they were hosting in recent years, whether it was regional qualifiers or World Cup qualifier, T20 World Cup qualifier, the video views, the engagement figures kept on going up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And just to kind of wrap up this point, they set a record at the 2019 World Cup qualifier in Dubai, or the UAE, for video traffic, video views. And they set that record without Afghanistan and without Nepal being present at that tournament. And historically, those were the two countries that always were the biggest traffic drivers in the associate world. Afghanistan obviously is now a test country, but when they were participating in these T20 World Cup qualifiers in 2010, 2012, 2013, 2015, any match involving Afghanistan or Nepal would just have monumental traffic compared to all the other matches. Well, both those teams weren't there, and yet they still set a record. So that shows that it's not just Nepal and Afghanistan anymore that people are caring about just in isolation. The whole associate community is driving interest. There's a demand. The context is there. All these matches have so much at stake. And the fact that these matches have something at stake in terms of qualification or the qualification path, it creates that demand. I've always found associate matches more fun to cover than, say, a West Indies T20, West Indies India T20 match in Florida, because the West Indies T20 match in Florida, yeah, the quality is high. Nobody's ever going to make a bogus claim about, oh, I love covering that Nepal versus USA match because the quality was just so intense and it was like the highest standard ever. I'm not going to try and con anybody into believing that. But in terms of a context point, a USA versus Nepal match at a World Cricket League event, I always preferred covering because the intensity and the drama because of what was at stake, depending on who won or who lost, was, in my mind, head and shoulders above a bilateral T20 in Florida between India and West Indies. Yeah, you might have Virat Kohli and Chris Gale in that match in Florida. The quality of players higher, but in terms of what was at stake and having things on a knife edge, there's very few places in cricket that can match where that exists in terms of the associate qualifying pathway events. And so for that reason, I think it's fantastic that these teams are getting that platform to be broadcast, and many of them for the first time.
Interesting you mentioned that what's at stake part, because having followed a lot of tennis also over the years, ADB came up with something called ADB Challenger Tour broadcast. And there's a lot at stake at ADB Challenger Tournament, which is the sort of the Division 2, sort of something what we go through associate level. And they started broadcasting all over the place, and the viewership of the streams kept going up and up. And there's a lot at stake on a lot of those Challenger tournaments, because the winner of certain tournaments actually get a wild card to a Grand Slam tournament, maybe at US Open or Australian Open or Wimbledon. So I do understand where you're coming from, but I think we have a great opportunity here to spread the game of cricket a lot more. Something what you just echoed.
No, absolutely, and that goes for men's cricket and women's cricket as well. I mean, all you have to do for women's cricket is take the example of Thailand. Okay, Thailand going to the Women's World Cup in Australia for the first time. I got to see them and cover them at the Women's World Cup qualifier in Scotland, and just the attitude that the team had was infectious. And the fact that they were all homegrown players, and that the board had really committed to not taking shortcuts and was willing to take their lumps with homegrown players over the course of the previous decade to get to that point and to see what it meant to them. I mean, half the team, including the captain and some of the leading players, were just bursting into tears when they secured that qualification berth. And then to get to Australia and not just get there, but compete in a respectable manner. It wasn't like they fell on their faces when they got there as first timers. They were quite reasonable in terms of their level of competitiveness, and arguably they were robbed of what would have been an epic upset against Pakistan because the rain came. They got to the final match of the group stage. They had nothing to lose. Whereas in the previous games, yeah, they were a bit tentative batting. They were more focused on, I guess, moral victories, if you want to call it that, batting out the 20 overs, not embarrassing themselves and having a respectable showing. Well, last game of the group stage, they threw all that out the window. We're just going to have some fun. No pressure. We've already been eliminated. Now we're going to take the time to really have at it. And they posted a phenomenal total, and then the rain came at the innings break. So we'll never know if they could have beaten Pakistan. But they were definitely extremely competitive against Pakistan. And if you take that Thailand example and spread that across, various regions, whether that's, I'm very excited to see the Brazil women in the upcoming women's qualifier for the Americas, because the Brazil women have been put on central contracts. So you've had women from Brazil who've been training year round, getting a chance to face off against USA and Canada and Argentina. And for as much investment that USA has had with some recent initiatives, very, very little of that money has been earmarked for women's cricket. And their women's cricket is lagging significantly behind. And it would be a hugely significant event if Brazil could spring a shock and beat USA, and that would then perhaps set a paradigm or have a paradigm shift for the region and for other regions to show this was the model that Thailand used. This is now the model that Brazil used in terms of committing resources to their women's team. Here's the impact it had in terms of knocking off USA. Maybe this is the playbook that we should be following going forward. And if that's broadcast, bring the point full circle, if that's broadcast, instead of just being played in the dark, if people are able to see that on a broadcast, whether it's a web stream or TV broadcast, whatever, and to have that blueprint of the Brazil women's team out of the Americas, having that shown on TV opens up so many opportunities, not just for Brazil specifically, but potentially for women's cricket broadly throughout the associate world.
Yeah, I mean, I have a follow-up on what you said. I mean, it's an absolutely amazing example you give with Thailand or Brazil, but you mentioned a lot about resources, and I'm aware of the fact that a lot of these associates at times have shoestring budgets. So what has the COVID-19 pandemic had? What kind of impact has it had on the bottom line, like financially?
This is a fascinating question. How do I answer this? You would be surprised to hear that in some countries, not to be too cynical about this, but not having any cricket for a year, not having any international cricket for a year, in some ways has been beneficial to countries.
Wow.
Because they've just pooled the financial allocations that trickle down from the ICC, and they haven't had to actually spend them on international events or international event preparation. So the associate countries, again, they get a finite amount of resources from the ICCs. So, for example, take the USA. I think traditionally the funding they were getting, the USA was getting from the ICC was in the $400,000 range. And most of that would be burned through by spending it on preparation camps or hiring maybe an additional assistant coach or consultant coach or something along those lines to prep for one of the 2 or 3 or 4 tours that they would have over the course of a calendar year. Well, having all cricket canceled for the year means they haven't actually had to travel anywhere and haven't had any events to play in. But as far as I understand, the ICC disbursement is still coming. So in some ways, that means either they've been able to rebuild their bank accounts, they just haven't spent it on anything, and they've been able to rebuild the bank account and kind of pool their money for something bigger and grander in 2021 or perhaps 2022. And for other countries, it's meant instead of having to burn 95% of their annual budget on the national team or high performance, to use the HR technical language, high performance focused programming or high performing resources, they've been able to. Some countries have opted to spend that money domestically where possible. Yet, COVID has disabled a lot of initiatives from being able to be carried out, but not in all places. So some countries, instead of their 2020 budget, instead of burning it on an international event that didn't happen, they might have devoted more resources to grassroots coaching or grassroots development, having local camps, having local clinics, whatever. And so from that standpoint, you would find that there are some associate countries who are not complaining that there hasn't been any international cricket in 2020. For them, it was like a healthy breather, or an option to reset and just maybe focus on doing some things that they put on the back burner for the longest time. And now they were able to actually put on the front burner, and actually instead of having kind of just a short-term narrow vision on short-term spending and short-term vision, we gotta just think about the next tournament, next whatever. They were able to kind of focus some of their money on some long-term projects. Not every country's like that, obviously. You have a country like the Netherlands or Scotland or Nepal or USA, kind of the countries in League Two, Cricket World Cup League Two, the ODI nations who would rather be playing cricket, and there's been a detrimental effect, I know, specifically in the USA, where when there was a full slate of cricket on the calendar, it allowed the players to be contracted. Well, because there was no cricket during the pandemic, USA Cricket decided we're going to slash your salaries essentially by 70 to 80%. There were some guys who were earning close to $100,000 a year on central contracts from USA Cricket. And because the pandemic happened and they said, well, you were on a central contract because we were paying you to play cricket and there's no cricket happening, well, we're just going to stop paying you or put you down to a very, very low salary. So some guys, like I said, who were earning close to $100,000 in terms of their total compensation, now are getting paid $1,600 a month. So essentially $20,000 a year over the course of the pandemic, just maybe marginally above minimum wage. So to go from $100,000 basically to $20,000 a year, that's a huge impact negatively that has happened to the USA players who were essentially contracted, and kind of the fringe players as well who were kind of jockeying for position for central contracts. So I guess to wrap up the question, it depends on where you are, where you're located. Has the stoppage of international cricket benefited you or hurt you? Often in the social world, depends on where exactly you're based and how high a standard your national team currently is.
Right. So, Peter, we have quite a few Cricket World Cups coming in the next few years. We have 2 T20 World Cups followed by a 50-over World Cup, and had a few questions pertaining to these tournaments. Firstly, I'd like to ask you, what are the qualification scenarios looking like? And by that, I mean the associate nations, like which associate nations have already qualified and which are looking really, they find themselves in a good position to qualify for these tournaments. And then secondly, I'd just like to know, what are your general thoughts on the formats of these tournaments? So I think you can particularly focus on the upcoming T20 tournament this year and the 50-over World Cup. Yeah.
So the T20 World Cup that's going to be happening in India originally was planned for Australia. The one that's in India, the qualification tournament happened in the UAE in October, November 2019. Netherlands beat Papua New Guinea in the final. And you had Scotland also come out of the event. You had Ireland come out of that event. You had Oman come out of that event. And I'm forgetting the sixth team who qualified. But basically the six teams who finished, Namibia is the sixth team who qualified out of that event. They were supposed to go to Australia, postponed. Now they flipped the tournaments. The one that was supposed to be in Australia is now going to be in India, coming up first. So that was just that qualifier happened in the UAE, and that was the last round of qualifying. And this goes back to the broadcast rights agreement. So qualifying would begin in regional qualifying. You've got 5 associate regions. You've got the Americas, which is North and South America, and basically the entire Caribbean that's not the West Indies. So, for example, countries like Cayman Islands, or Bahamas, or Bermuda in the North Atlantic. You have Americas, Africa, Europe, Asia, mainland Asia, and then East Asia Pacific, which would involve Pacific Island countries like Vanuatu, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Japan is included in that in terms of cricket. And so you have these regional qualifying events, and then the top teams are the top finishers to come out of the regional qualifying, and different regions have different numbers of slots, qualification slots, depending on the strength of the region, and also how many and as a knock-on effect of that, how many teams from that region have already qualified to a higher, a more advanced stage of qualifying in terms of global qualifier, or if they've already qualified for the T20 World Cup itself. So, for example, Asia in their regional qualifier they only have one slot allotted for their regional qualifier compared to the Americas, which has 2 slots allotted from their regional qualifier. That's not to say that the Americas is stronger than Asia and that they deserve 2 spots and Asia only deserves 1. It's a consequence of the fact that if you qualify for the World Cup, you then automatically are given a spot in the subsequent World Cup qualifier. So in the past, that would have meant that, or in previous instances, that means that Oman, Hong Kong, Afghanistan, UAE would all have had spots. Nepal has had spots in the World Cup itself. So they don't have to necessarily go back and participate in the regional qualifier. So Asia could potentially have 5 teams or 6 teams being represented at the World Cup itself as associate countries or at the global qualifier, but only 1 team comes out of the regional qualifier because of the teams that are remaining. You've got, say, Qatar, Singapore, Nepal, who was KO'd and the last time didn't even make it because Singapore beat them, Malaysia. You got all these teams. There's different factors in terms of the regional qualifying. And so you have the 5 regional qualifiers feeds into the global qualifier, and then from the global qualifier, you have 6 teams advance to the World Cup. I'm really excited. I'm really excited to see Papua New Guinea in the T20 World Cup in India. A lot of people who haven't seen them, I think they'll be very entertaining for people who haven't seen them before. I always love covering Papua New Guinea in person. They're one of my favorite teams to cover when I go to tournaments. Whether that's just to cover tournament in general or it's because I'm going because USA is there and Papua New Guinea is also there as a consequence of that. Papua New Guinea historically have just an infectious attitude. If people loved the Thailand women at the Women's T20 World Cup, I think they'll love the Papua New Guinea men. The Papua New Guinea men just have this infectious attitude. They're high energy on the field. They're extremely athletic. Their fielding is always sensational. They just play with smiles on their faces. It sounds like a very basic, silly thing to say, but oftentimes at elite level, the players get so carried away with fucking so intense and something big is at stake, and they forget to have fun. It sounds silly to say, but they forget to have fun. And the Papua New Guinea guys, you can tell they're having fun. And it's just the way they go about their cricket is so fun to see. In terms of, I guess the other part of the question, format, number of teams, I'm always for more teams no matter what. I mean, 16 teams is better than the 10. 16 teams in the T20 World Cup is better than 10 in the 50 World Cup. I think the competitive standard of associate cricket is such that in the T20 World Cup, you could easily have 5 teams, 5 groups of 4. In an initial stage, you could have 20 teams instead of having 16 teams. My ideal format would be 4 groups of 4 and then straight knockouts. I think they formulated the group stage in such a way it's extremely convoluted, and it's simply just to stretch out more games to satisfy the TV rights contract. If I had my way, I would make it 4 groups of 4 FIFA World Cup style, and top 2 advance and then straight knockouts. I think you could have 5 groups of 4. Or expand the opening round to include more teams to get it up to 20. Because again, keep in mind the strength and depth of associate cricket is so strong right now. Nepal didn't even advance to the global qualifier this last time around. So you've got the quality of teams there that Nepal didn't even make it out of regional qualifying. USA didn't even make it out of regional qualifying. 2 teams with ODI status didn't make it out of regional qualifying for the T20 World Cup. So I think there's the strength and depth there to warrant it. And if you think about Nepal specifically, you've got a player there in Sandeep Lamachane who is good enough to get T20 contracts all around the world, including the IPL. How can you have a player that good and not be a part of the T20 World Cup? I think it's a huge miss to not have a player like that. And that's through nobody's fault but Nepal, that they didn't do their own business out of Asia and qualify. But again, the point is you've got much stronger depth than you had 10, 15 years ago. And similarly in 50 over cricket, I think the the decision to go back from 14 teams to 10 teams was a huge mistake. I think it was an extremely regressive move. I understand the desire that a lot of people make in terms of, well, we want the best teams only. The World Cup should be the best of the best. I think the World Cup should be a showcase, a festival, and there is room for the best of the best to be there, but there's also room for other teams to showcase what cricket is doing around the world. And the cricket calendar as such is kind of so narrowly focused on full members as it is. If you limit the World Cup to just full members, all you're seeing is just more of the same. You're just seeing more of the same that you usually do on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. Having the World Cup expanded to the associate world gives these teams an opportunity to show what they can do, and just adds flavor to the World Cup, and it offers these countries. It's hugely significant to these countries. This is basically their biggest opportunity to sell the game locally and broadly, and drive participation, drive sponsorship, drive interest in general. If you take a look at a player like Nitish Kumar from Canada, who just had a fantastic Super 50 tournament in the West Indies, he was playing for the Leeward Islands. Having that inspiration there from somebody like John Davison, to see that guy on TV and hit a World Cup World Cup century against the West Indies, that'll inspire somebody like Nitish Kumar to pick up a bat and go play in the World Cup. And 12 years later, Nitish Kumar was playing in the World Cup as a 16-year-old in India, in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And you want then, but instead of Nitish Kumar inspiring the next generation, that opportunity has been cut off. Kevin O'Brien, his century against England, 10-year anniversary a couple of days ago, that inspired the next wave of Irish players to come through. You're getting the Delaney brothers, who are now part of the Irish setup, and you're getting guys like Lorcan Tucker and other kind of youngsters who are kind of the ripple effect of Kevin O'Brien's century. Well, those guys aren't getting a chance to compete in World Cups. And it's a very deflating thing and a very suffocating thing to see somebody like Kevin O'Brien project that dream, project that inspiration, and then to just completely erase that opportunity, I think is a regressive move for world cricket in general. And I think it's about time that they reconsider the number of teams in the 50 over World Cup when the next broadcast rights agreement for the next cycle comes forward, because the main reason why the 50 over World Cup was reduced to 10 teams was mainly to do with the TV rights contract and what the TV rights broadcasters demanded. And hopefully the ICC, in conjunction with the TV broadcasters, can be convinced that it is in their best interest to expand the 50 over World Cup for the 2023 to 2031 rights cycle.
Right. So yeah, moving on to a bit about USA cricket. You talked about 50 over cricket, and we had a lot of 50 over cricket tournaments or tri-series in particular, which are just getting postponed. And we just learned last few weeks ago that the 44 player tournament has been the training camp, which was supposed to take place, is postponed. Are we expecting to hear any news that these players will be called back to training camp? What's the news now from USA Cricket camp?
No, I think once the plug was pulled on the tournament, the tri-series that was supposed to be in Oman and Papua New Guinea again, going back to what we discussed before about the benefits, positives and negatives of funding in COVID and what you would typically use your ICC money for. Well, they had announced that camp because we want to organize our players to get them prepared to go to Oman and then Papua New Guinea. Well, now that USA doesn't have to send a team to Oman and Papua New Guinea, cancel the camp. Why should we spend that money? Let's focus that money somewhere else. It's the attitude and the mindset of the administrators. which is perfectly justifiable. So until and unless there is something scheduled that is later in the summer, and there are quite a lot of Tri-Series events still on the calendar or later in the calendar year for 2021 that USA is supposed to be involved in. Hopefully, as the wheels start to turn with the pandemic situation in terms of the vaccines, more and more people get vaccinated, and for better or worse, regardless of which side of the fence you sit on politically, the fact that Texas is opening up its doors and business is open in Texas, that is theoretically an encouraging sign for cricket because, as some people may have seen, USA Cricket announced they're going to have their under-19 national championship to be held from April 4th to 11th in Texas. Now, whether you agree with or disagree with how fast or how quickly businesses should be reopened, USA Cricket has taken that as a signal from the state of Texas, that they can schedule a tournament there because Texas is open and Texas is a location where they can bring their players to play competitive cricket in terms of the under-19 national championship and have that event to use as preparation and talent identification and selection for the USA Under-19 World Cup squad that's going to be participating later this summer in an Under-19 World Cup qualifier. If you look at comparatively, last year when they tried to do these minor league T20 exhibition matches, parts of California, the teams that were the franchises in California couldn't play in Southern California. Mayor Eric Garcetti basically prohibited sporting activities in Southern California, certain parts of Florida, certain parts of other states, cricket was just off limits. So if you have an area where sports are being sanctioned, especially youth sports, I'm a proponent of encouraging youth sports participation in the modern climate, because if you're somebody who believes in the data and follow the science, follow the data, young people are not at risk, not nearly as susceptible and at risk as adults and elderly adults in particular. So I feel like it is a prudent decision, taking into consideration all of the data available, that there's no reason why USA Cricket should not be staging an under-19 national championship, taking into consideration, again, the evidence of all the NCAA sports that have continued. College football, which is a very high contact sport, just basically played a full season with a national championship throughout the fall. And that is with 250, 300-pound sweaty men engaging in full contact every single play. Cricket doesn't have that level of contact that college football does. And the NFL does. NFL, same way. Just played a full season, played every single game. The NFL was able to complete a full 16-game season with every single team through to the playoffs, through to the Super Bowl. Yes, they had sophisticated testing in place and we're playing in some form of bubbles. I don't expect that for the USA Under-19 National Championships for cricket, but the level of contact that you have on a cricket field is not nearly the level of contact that you have on a football field. So I'm really encouraged by the fact that USA Cricket took this decision, and fingers crossed the tournament will go off without a hitch in Texas, and hopefully that will be, if it does go off without any negative incidents or doesn't get interrupted in any way, hopefully that will spur cricket to be able to be hosted not just in the USA domestically, but also for the USA national team if they're due to host matches later in the summer, and also for associate cricket more broadly.
So you were earlier talking about the formats of the T20 World Cups. I look at the format of the 50-year World Cup. I think the way it's right now, placed in the World Cup League 2 right now, I think they probably have the best chance to ever qualify for a 50-year World Cup than they ever had before. Because I see the amount of opportunities every associate team has. Just you look at the top 3 teams qualify from the World Cup League 2, and even if you finish at the bottom, they still have another chance in the World Cup playoff group. So, what do you think? The same? You feel the same that this is probably the USA's best place right now to ever qualify for a 50-year World Cup, which I believe is still a premier event as compared to other World Cups?
Not necessarily. I mean, from a competitive standpoint, yes, they're playing a consistently higher standard in League Two. So they're playing a consistent standard of ODI cricket against likes of Scotland and Nepal and UAE and Namibia and the other teams that are involved, Papua New Guinea. I think it's actually going to be far, far more difficult for USA to qualify for this World Cup than it has been in the past. Yes, they have ODI status, so on paper they're playing a higher standard. But just simply the fact that the World Cup is only 10 teams, I think it's a monumental battle for them to qualify. You have, again, the 10 teams qualify. You've got 12 full members. Okay, so you take into consideration the fact that for the last World Cup in England, Zimbabwe and Ireland didn't qualify. Okay, so USA will have to compete with not only the other 6 teams that are currently in League Two. They've got to compete with Netherlands, who is the lone associate who's in the Super League. Okay, plus 2 other teams who are test nations who didn't qualify for the last World Cup. So USA is not only going to have to best everybody in League Two, they're going to have to best the Netherlands, Ireland, and Zimbabwe, and at least one other country amongst Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, New Zealand. Somebody out of those 2 teams, because again, to remind everybody, the top 8 qualify for the World Cup. Top 8, the top 7 plus the hosts. Okay, so India doesn't have to qualify. India's games in the ODI Super League are effectively meaningless. They could lose every single game in the ODI Super League. They could play a second string team. They could play an A team or a B team India if they felt like it in terms of the ODI Super League, and it would have 0 impact whatsoever in terms of their World Cup qualification. And in essence, if they are picking weaker teams, the significance is on who the opponent is. If India picks a full-strength team against Australia in their 13-team Super League matches, but they pick a second string team against, say, Bangladesh or Ireland or Afghanistan, well, that's a huge advantage to those other teams that they're only facing a second string India side. So the top 7 qualify. So at least essentially at least 5 teams out of, let's say theoretically Ireland, Zimbabwe, Netherlands, Afghanistan, and let's say Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, one of the 2, doesn't finish in the top 8. They're going to fall back into the qualifier. Now you have a global 10-team World Cup qualifier for the final 2 spots. You've got the top 8 automatically qualifying the points table in the Super League. 2 more spots are up for grabs in the qualifier. Who's in the qualifier? Well, the 5 teams that didn't automatically qualify to the Super League. And then 3 teams out of League Two, and then 2 more teams in the repechage event. So you're asking USA again to beat all those teams in addition to Scotland, Nepal, Oman, and they already struggle enough as it is. If people remember the tri-series they had in Nepal where they got bowled out for 35. So yes, on paper they're playing ODI cricket. I think it's just a monumental challenge to qualify now compared to people may not remember, but back in 1982, 1986, 1993, 1996, when the USA was participating in the ICC trophy consistently, USA came very, very close to qualifying for some World Cups back 25, 30 years ago. At that point in time, again, for people who may not be as into cricket history, especially in the associate world, USA was right up there with the likes of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was an associate country. Some people might not remember that, believe it or not. USA was right up there with Zimbabwe. USA was right up there with Bangladesh. USA, in fact, at one point in time was ranked higher than Bangladesh. USA was at one point ranked higher than Ireland. In 2001, at the ICC Trophy in Canada, USA smacked around an Ireland team that had Ed Joyce in it.
Wow.
Okay, USA won a match at the ICC Trophy, which was the former name of the World Cup qualifier. USA won a match, I think, by 6 wickets, and they won, I think, with 7 or 8 overs to spare against Ireland. Ireland team that had Ed Joyce and I think a few other names that went to the 2007 World Cup. Okay. And again, you remember USA participated in the Champions Trophy in 2004 in England. Yeah. USA and Kenya were the only 2 associate countries at that event. So once upon a time, USA was very, 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 very close to qualifying for World Cups. They were better than, again, they were right up there with the Netherlands, better than Scotland, or right up there with Scotland, better than Ireland. They were definitely better than Ireland, better than Bangladesh. And all these countries have better than Hong Kong. Hong Kong has qualified for T20 World Cups. Hong Kong beat Bangladesh at a T20 World Cup. USA at one time was way better than Hong Kong, and they've kind of stagnated for a very long time until very recently, starting to move up the ladder again. All those times in history, USA, I think, had a much better shot at qualifying for the World Cup, because their talent was so good. At that point in history, it was really just talent versus talent. Whoever had the best talent, none of these teams really prepared much. It was just show up, get off the plane, and whoever's got the best talent wins. There wasn't much, all these teams were amateur. There wasn't any professionalism. Every country who was going to these ICC trophies, their players, the whole playing squad was amateur players. They had day jobs. So it was really just a pure talent versus talent event. And USA traditionally had always had really good talent. That's not the case anymore in the professional era. And that professional area has seeped into associate cricket. And so when it was just talent v talent, USA was right up there near the top of the associate heap. And also, again, at that point in time, back in history, you had more teams participating in World Cups. There were 14 teams or 16 teams. So it was possible for Bermuda to qualify for World Cup. You think of the 2007 World Cup. Currently, you would say Asia has the strongest depth in associate cricket. At one point in time, the Americas had outstanding depth in associate cricket, because in a few year time span, you had Canada and Bermuda qualifying for a World Cup, and you had USA qualifying for a Champions Trophy, all within a couple of years of each other. Americas has fallen back. They've regressed because, or more, I would say accurately, they stood still, because for so long, the Americas region teams relied on just pure talent, natural talent, to get by and compete with these other teams. Whereas Asia in particular, the teams within Asia, a team like Nepal in particular, or Oman and UAE, they've really invested resources into local cricket or just in general to build up the professionalism of their sides, to do more consistent training, get better facilities, better infrastructure. And that has allowed them to kind of leapfrog the Americas and other regions. Kenya has fallen back. Africa as a whole has kind of fallen back from the heights of where Kenya was back in the late 90s and 2000s. Now Namibia is kind of picking up the slack. Uganda has caught up to Kenya as well. So there's a lot happening there. But again, just to answer your question, bring it back full circle. Again, yes, USA has ODI status on paper. Theoretically, they're as close to the highest ranking they've ever had. The highest ranking they ever had was when they went to the Champions Trophy. They were ranked 12th in the world at that point in time. So they're not quite at their highest ranking in history. They're close to it, but just purely about the nature of the fact that only 10 teams qualify for the World Cup, the 50th World Cup. I just think it would be a monumental achievement if they were able to do it.
All right, then now it's time for us to move on to the final topic of our discussion, and it's going to be a rather simple topic. Peter, I'd like to know, according to you, who are the top 3 emerging talents in men's associate cricket and the top 3 in women's associate cricket? What do you like about them, and why do you really rate them?
Well, I put some thought into this beforehand, and I was trying to kind of theorize or categorize prospects. Young players. What age would I put the cutoff? Or is there a certain cutoff of how many matches a certain player has represented the country? So I was thinking of like young players who really haven't played a lot of matches and are basically under the age of 25. But guys or girls who have shown a bit of promise that makes me think they've got something going on that could push them into being an elite player at associate level, or perhaps even just an elite player in general and potentially a prospect for T20 leagues in the same manner as Sandy Blamachane or Ali Khan in that mold. I would say one of the ones that has jumped out at me, Kushal Malla from Nepal. For people who were following that tri-series last year, he scored a half century on debut against the USA. He just looked, or maybe it was against Oman. I forget who it was on debut against. It was in that tri-series. It was either USA or Oman. But Kushal Malla scored a 50 on debut, and just his ball striking was incredible. He didn't look like a 16-year-old. I don't know if he's the Shahid Afridi version of 16, or if he's actual 16 and he's just had all his spinach and he's been drinking all his milk and he's just big for his age, which is possible. Stephen Taylor was the same way. Stephen Taylor, when he was a 15-year-old playing for USA, 16-year-old, he looked like he was about 26. He looked like he was about 10 years older than his age. But you knew Stephen Taylor was 16 because when he opened his mouth and he spoke like a teenager and used a lot of teenage slang. And, he was a 16-year-old when he was in conversation. But some people have that physical maturity, and Kushal Malla has that physical maturity as a teenager. And I think it's a shame that the pandemic struck when it did, because he had a fantastic debut for Nepal. And now he's had to sit for a year instead of being able to build off that momentum. But if he can continue to pick up where he left off before the pandemic, I think he's somebody with tremendous promise for Nepal. And hopefully, from a Nepal's perspective, will kind of lessen the burden that's been held by the likes of Paras Kadka and Sandy Blamachane and Gyanendra Malla and other players who've been kind of holding that torch and being the torchbearers for Nepal. From the USA, Kareem Agor, very talented left arm spinning all-rounder. I think of him as an all-rounder anyway. He's somebody who grew up, born in the US, but grew up in Antigua. And he played for the Leeward Islands under-19 team, and he played for them mainly as a batsman. So in his junior cricket, he was primarily a batsman, but he's kind of evolved into more of a spinner. His kind of left arm spin bowling he's taken over. And that's how he got into the U.S. team, through his left arm spin capabilities. He's a dynamic fielder, just an electric fielder. But because he had that foundation in batting, when he's played for USA, he's batted at 7, 8, 9. I think he's far more talented than that. I think he can be a genuine all-rounder the more opportunities he gets. And he's only 22. And so over the next couple of years, I think he's somebody who, if he keeps on getting more experience, I think he could be a tremendous star for USA and a tremendous star in the associate cricket world. He's got a great work ethic too. That's something that always stands out to me. It's not just the talent. There's a lot of guys who have talent. I've seen plenty of guys flame out in the USA in particular who have talent, but the work ethic doesn't match it. He's got the work ethic to match it. I think he's very exciting. And then in terms of the men's players, I've got a toss up with two guys from the UAE, Jonathan Figge, batsman, opening batsman, top order batsman, and Vritya Aravind, wicketkeeper. Again, both teenagers, both represented UAE at the last Under-19 World Cup. They've also been in the men's team, though. As teenagers, they've gotten a lot of opportunities early on. As bad as the match fixing saga and the spot fixing saga was for the UAE, and seeing Shayman Anwar and Mohammed Naveed suspended and quite a few other players disappear, and their kind of status is up in the air. a silver lining to that whole episode was that it opened the door for quite a number of young players to suddenly be thrust into the national team and get a lot of opportunities far earlier than they probably would have under normal circumstances. And Jonathan Figge and Bertia Arvind really impressed me with how they've performed at the senior level earlier in their career. And the UAE side had a really, really impressive chase against USA in the Tri-Series in Dubai. I think it was against the USA anyway. Either against the USA or Scotland. I'm pretty sure it was against the USA. Could have been against Scotland. Regardless, they just stood out. Maturity beyond their years. I was just really, really impressed by how they performed. And I think both of them, Aravind as a wicketkeeper and Figge just as a top order batsman, I think that they're from the UAE guys to keep an eye on. In terms of women's cricket, Catherine Fraser from Scotland, teenager, off spinner. Again, I think she's only 15 or 16, but one of the performances that really stood out for me, I saw her play against the USA in Scotland. I think it was in a warm-up game at the T20 World Cup qualifier, and again, she's mature for her age. She's tall. She's athletic. She doesn't look 16. She looks like she's been in the squad for a few years. If you just see her mannerisms on the field, and she's got the skill to match it. And in the Tri-Series, I think it was a Tri-Series or Quad Series before the T20 World Cup qualifier, the women's T20 World Cup qualifier, she took 3 for 12 or 3 for 10, something like that, against Thailand in a match where Scotland beat Thailand. So if you think about Thailand, qualifying for the World Cup, coming out of that qualifier in Scotland, going to the World Cup, Catherine Fraser as a teenager for Scotland had basically a player of the match performance against Thailand in a victory for Scotland with the ball. So that's a hugely promising sign for the Scotland team. If you pair her with the Bryce sisters, Catherine and Sarah Bryce have been phenomenal, and they're still quite young in their careers. But to have somebody at the caliber of Catherine Fraser supporting them is quite exciting from a Scotland perspective. And then from Thailand, I picked two players from Thailand. I think initially when I was thinking of players to pick out, I was racking my brains to think of somebody either from the US or from the Netherlands. You could pick somebody like Ster Callis, who is still quite young for the Netherlands. She scored a century sometime around the time of the T20 World Cup qualifying, and she's always just bullied the US whenever she's played the US. She's really impressive. She's played state cricket in Australia as well. But you forget the fact that Thailand is an associate in women's cricket. They qualify the World Cup. They're really head and shoulders above the associate fields in the women's cricket, but they're still an associate. And so the two players from Thailand who stood out to me as young players in terms of their qualifying journey at the World Cup, Suliporn Laomi, leg spinner, very talented young leg spinner. I really feel like she's got a lot to offer, and especially in terms of leg spin, which you don't see an awful lot of that at associate level, men or women. And then Nadakan Chantam as a top order batter. I feel Nadakan Chantam really impressed me. And again, she's still quite young. Still has a lot of years to offer compared to say the captain, Sonaran Tivak, who's been around quite some time. If you're looking for players who are leading the next generation or might be around for 10 years, I think Suliporn Laomi and Nadakan Chantam for Thailand in terms of women's associate cricket are going to be very, very strong contributors to their continued success over the coming years.
Okay, gentlemen, it's time for me to wrap up our discussion for today. Thank you, Peter. It's been great fun having you on our show, our discussion show, and it's been a very enjoyable as well as a very informative session with you. And absolutely loved the forthright manner in which you address the topics. I'm pretty sure that our viewers would also appreciate it. And before we let you go, Peter, could you tell our viewers where they could follow you and your work?
Well, I've been doing quite a bit more ball-by-ball commentary on Cricket Info recently than article writing, because a lot of the match coverage that I would typically do has been put on pause because of the pandemic. There's not really been much associate cricket happening during the pandemic, but I still contribute quite a significant amount of coverage in terms of article coverage for associate cricket when and where possible for Cricket Info. Hopefully that'll resume sooner rather than later when the pandemic hopefully kind of starts to become less invasive in society. And I'm on Twitter at Peter Della Penna, the fancy Italian name, PeterDellaPenna. Just rolls right off the tongue on Twitter and on Facebook as well. So that's where I try and stay active. Twitter more so. And I do try and make an effort to respond to anybody who reaches out. I've had enough mentors or interactions with people on the way where a lot of people helped me along the way. And so I always do try to make as much effort as possible to, if somebody reaches out to me, whether that's on Twitter and just has a tweet in response to an article, or tweets at a question, or some sort of other comment they want to make, I do try and take the time to respond. So that's generally the best way to get me. And I'm really excited to have been asked by you guys to come on your podcast. And it's really been a pleasure to chat cricket with you guys.
Likewise. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Peter Della Penna. And until the next episode, namaste.